It wasn't that Liam had a problem with air cars. Air cars were just fine. There wasn't a smoother ride in the world than an air car. An air truck going off-road for a wildly rolling savannah was a whole different proposition. Liam held onto Pris's hand as they rolled over a slope, and his stomach kept going. Willis had no forests, but the vast grasslands had a lot of hills. There were big hills, small hills, rocky hills, and pointy hills. There were hummocks, hillocks, mounds, and mounts. The ride from the Itala freight yards was 3 hours closer to the family ranch, that much was true. That still made it a 3-hour drive across the open countryside, and as the truck soared down into a long gully, his stomach counted every minute. Liam held on as the truck gathered speed, trying to focus on anything else. At least Pris was there. At Builder's good-natured nudging, they spent a lot of time together for the last couple of days. Without a doubt, Belle was his girl, but Pris was more of a city girl than Builder. Looking out the window, Liam watched as Builder leapt a ravine on the back of her Rigoi, laughing with the farmhands as they kept pace with the air truck. She seemed to be having the time of her life. You didn't learn about seasickness in the middle of Canada. It wasn't a thing you ran into, riding an air car down a highway, but their driver seemed to be playing chicken with every Turks they passed, and his stomach lurched as they yawned about another knot of the gigantic space cows. Focus, damn it! Anything! It was distracting enough to meet Builder's Rakiri friends, but that only lasted while they were still at the stockyard. Having gone from the breezy cool of a chill winter to the arid heat of a Willis summer, he supposed it made sense. Rakiri loved ranching, but the only sensible thing to do about the heat was to cut their hair short. Sure, they were sporting halter tops, and he'd made it through introductions without embarrassing himself. It was still damn hard not to stare at Rakiri sporting poodle cuts. The driver swerved again, gathering speed for an embankment, and Liam gripped Pris's hand and focused hard. So, I never saw a Rigoi before. You'll see them wherever you see Taurochs, Pris nodded. Unfazed by the rise, she wasn't quite smiling at his distress, but she did seem sympathetic. It was a fair trade. He hadn't thrown up on her yet, either. I suppose that humans haven't learned much about flora and fauna of the galaxy. Well, there's more native biomes than anyone could learn in a lifetime. I meant the stuff the Imperium moves around. Hey, I watched Mutual of Orma's Wild Kingdom, Liam grumbled defensively. Pris stared back at him and cocked her head to one side. Her short black hair spilled over her shoulder, a picture of Shilvanti incomprehension. It was a show on Sunday night. Half the time it showed animals on Earth, and every other week it showed something out in the galaxy. My uncle said it was propaganda, but Marlin Perkins was pretty cool. Liam shrugged. It was kid stuff, but the show had been pretty informative. My uncle said it was a TOS ripoff, but I just added it to the list of things he didn't like, which covered almost everything. TOS? Pris didn't lift her chin and frowned a bit more. The driver jinked the air truck, which did interesting things to her cleavage. Liam focused. The old series. The original Marlin Perkins was a real guy. For a new show, they hired a zoologist who was really ripped, stuck him in khakis, and then dubbed over the original guy's face. A lot of humans hated it, but I still thought it was great when I was a kid. One week he'd been wrestling a boa constrictor in its natural habitat. The next week it was something on another planet. It was usually pretty dangerous, and you could tell the people off Earth weren't human, but I didn't care. It lasted like 3 or 4 seasons until the thing with the great white shark. Sure. Pris bit her lip. She was blushing and had probably caught him sneaking a peek. They'd entered a long grassy plain and stopped pitching enough for his stomach to start settling down. So, what is a Mutual of... What was it? Mutual of Omaha. It's an insurance company. Most of them survived the landing by claiming act of God, then got attacked by the resistance after that. Anyway, Mutual of Omaha got by, and somehow the Shilvanti heard about the old show. Someone must have thought it would be a good idea to educate humans about the galaxy, so one week Marlin would be out there getting clawed up by cougars or wrestling an alligator, and the other half of the time he'd be on dirt or somewhere trying not to get gored to death. Well, it does sound like a good idea. She shrugged, then slid back into a corner, watching him. Pris wasn't as well built as Belder, but the pose arched her back, which did really interesting things to her anatomy. Damn, man. Focus. I suppose. I mean, fixing the environment told everyone the Imperium was serious, but I guess I grew up just believing it. I mean, is the environment important on your world too? And what about that Rigoi? I swear it grabbed hold of Belle and sounded like it was singing to her. Rigoi are pretty mean, but they're high on the Sentience index. Pris nodded and started ticking points off her fingertips. As a species, they're short of full marks for sapiens, but they are about as bright as 5-year-olds, can use tools with their hands, and if you get to bond with one, they're a friend for life. Liam looked outside, where Belder had her body down along the Rigoi's back, her face nestled in the feathery ruff around its neck. That's neat. What happens if you don't bond with one? Then your life is a little under a minute. Pris looked out the window at Belder and shook her head. Don't you have any on Earth? Species on the sentient index, I mean? Well, yeah. There are whales. The Japanese got a little pissy about not being able to hunt them, but the Imperium said a hard no. Dolphins, apes, even parrots too. I saw one show about a parrot that knew over 3,000 words, what they meant, and even invented language when it needed new words. They used tools too. I mean, I don't know about whales, but dolphins, apes and parrots do, and the Imperium made them protected. A lot of older folks didn't get it. Some people just thought the Earth and everything else on it was ours to use up. You mean anyone else? Pris looked like she was studying him, somehow, and the cabin felt a little sultry. She caught his glance and blushed, waving out the window at the Rigoi running beside the truck. Just because you're the only technological species on the planet doesn't mean you aren't sharing your world. There are lots of sentient species in the galaxy, but even more that are semi-sapient. That's why the Imperium cares so much about the environment. We saw what the Ujarans had done when we reached what was left of their homeworld. We're custodians. 1 billion years from now, this may be their galaxy. But it's almost impossible to kill off a species that's expanded much, Liam shrugged. He knew the arguments both ways. Some people thought the Imperium was doing its best to hold humanity down to 1 star. It didn't seem like a topic he wanted to get into. I mean, 1/9 of the galaxy is a lot of planets, and the Imperium covers 40 billion stars. Pris looked back at him and smiled. It was a confident smile, the kind of smile he could like a lot. Not like Belder's, which was wild and unrestrained, or bashful when she blushed. Pris had a smile that was confident without being smug. That's why we take care of them like a garden. We're caretakers. It was one thing to like someone at their best, and another thing to know them at their worst. His stomach was feeling rebellious, and if he threw up in the car, he'd probably see which Pris was. He focused and decided to test the waters. What about the Ulnus? Aren't they in the garden too? What about weeds? The Ulnus homeworld wasn't that far from Avaton, you know. Liam, there are some species, very few, but some, that are totally antithetical to all other life. Maybe you see what the Ulnus are now, but you don't understand what they were. What they'll turn back into if enough settle into one place. Pris was looking at him sharply, and there was real pain behind it. After a moment she huffed and looked away. Belder really is a Turok's girl. I mean, I know she said so, but seeing is believing. I'm sorry. Liam had the unmistakable feeling he just danced onto a minefield. It sounds like you have history. I didn't mean to hit any sore spots. It's all right. Pris closed her eyes and sighed. Yes, there's history, and you couldn't know. There are still a lot of Ulnus attacks in our sector. Too many. The Ulnus are just... Look, I don't want to talk about it. The Imperium does what it can to take care of our worlds. When it comes to other species, that includes your apes, the Rigoi... All species that can work together are important. Should I have the creeps or something? This isn't going to sound like the plot to The Thing, is it? Pris looked at him blankly. He shrugged. It's a movie. Horror stuff that will keep you up at night. I don't like horror, but the Unus are horrible. Pris frowned. Besides, I can't forgive what they did to the Rhinal. I love my friend Pokey. Yeah! Shanky yelled, tearing through the room and waving his knife like a little green maniac. Yeah, yeah, yeah! Tom Steinberg shook his head. He couldn't really blame the little guy. God love Avie, she was a good woman, but after finding Pat Veery, he'd known he was in trouble. Dad was right. Never bring your work home with you. Of course, telling the girl to make herself scarce hadn't come off right. Maybe it was the language. Maybe it was the girl. Of course, Petra intended to be a bit literal, the way you could call a brick wall a bit stubborn. The only thing worse than having a Petra in the house was having no idea where. Shanky did, judging by the little guy's reactions. He'd been barreling around the house with his knife out since Avie left to spend some time with the pups. It was still a nice idea, but he still read between the lines. So, I'm her hacked. What am I supposed to do with her? It's not like she has clearance. I can't take her to do real work. And how the hell will I explain her to Adam? On the other hand, it wasn't like he could say no. Having a Persian make you a hacked was like saying you all the choices in the world to take the one option you had. And if there was a way out, the Persian weren't telling. I'll just have to keep her busy. Somehow. Yeah! Tom watched Shanky charge past and dive behind the couch, knife first. Damn. First I've got to calm him down before Avie gets back. At least going out to calm her nerves was a good idea. He'd been scoping out a water berth for Adam as part of his work. It was the high end of Prelintori, with a pretty ritzy clubhouse built a couple of centuries back by some noble. About 200 years back, Harbour Point had bought the property and turned it into a club on the water with an exclusive marina and a nice beach. He'd been negotiating a membership with the board for Indara. As Adam's yacht manager, his work was never done, and sending Avie down to scope out the beach seemed like a good move. Prelintori was damned nice. Good services and amenities. Good schools for the pups. Avie had been wanting to take the pups down to the beach, and the cold didn't bother Red Dixie in the least. They'd have the whole place to themselves, and... Tom's omnipad rang, and it broke his thoughts as he picked up. It was Avie on the line. Wait, what? Honey, what do you mean? They did what? As Tom listened, his blood began to boil. No. What? Dame Gelf is the one I was dealing with and... No, honey, I don't blame you. Just grab the pups and come home. Tom felt his teeth starting to grind. I love you too. I swear. I'll handle it. He could still hear Shanky muttering behind the couch, so wherever his new ward had gotten off to, that wasn't it. That Gelf bitch needed payback. And he had a loaded Pesrin and wasn't afraid to use her. Tom took a deep breath and raised his voice. Pat Veery, get out here, right now! Tom looked up and had just enough time to roll onto the couch as the Pesrin dropped through the vent in the ceiling. The girl managed a soundless three-point landing before standing up. It pissed him off that she looked cocky about it. What pissed him off more was that he couldn't have pulled that off when he was 20, much less make it look good. Good. Pat Veery, what were you doing? You keep unusual things in the attic. Pat Veery might have rolled her shoulders, but it was damn hard to tell. There were many interesting pictures. Hey! Keep out of the steam trunks. That's my private stuff. Tom felt his temples starting to pound. Besides, we've got work to do. The couch quivered beneath him. Yeah! Zachariah held Jennifer's hand as Francis gave a triumphant cry, startling the tour guide who was shepherding the whole lot of them around the assembly of noble houses. The assembly of nobles wasn't precisely a senate. In practice, it seemed to work a lot more like a church social, just on a huge scale. It expressed the will of the noble houses to the empress, helped form a collective opinion, and generally took care of making her will into policy. As 2 seats at each house, it kinda gave an idea of just how big the Imperium was, without a single word spoken. The building alone was pretty impressive. The tour guide claimed it was the biggest unsupported dome in the galaxy, and looking across the expanse of the hall, Zachariah could believe it. A small town could fit neatly in the inner ring of the major houses, while the area of the seating surrounding that could have grown food enough to feed it. Underneath, the whole place was served by a labyrinthine complex of offices, restaurants, libraries, and who knew what. But just seeing this was pretty neat. The dome overhead looked like a perfect replica of the sky. The guide had explained that it could mimic the day outside, the stars at night, or turn into the biggest projector screen in creation. Hannah, naturally, was fascinated. Zachariah sent the guide a sympathetic smile as she attempted to recapture the attention of the Shivanti contingent of their group. Having found the seat of House Dasari, Lady Phrysis Dasari was preening like a peacock and proudly regaling the family with tales of glories past. Personally, he was inclined to follow the guide if she gave up and left. This was no place to get lost in, and finding the bus home would be a real pain. Of course, Phrysis had plenty of reason to be proud as punch. This was undoubtedly the highlight of her year, possibly decade. And while they were in the outer ring of minor houses, it was still something. Big as the Imperium was, House Dasari could say they were a part of all this. It was intriguing to see how Trixis, Solana, Umina, and Ree were taking it all in, expressions of awe lighting their faces. Even Gesserin was looking impressed and walking around with a spring in his step. Ironically, it wasn't much to look at. 2 chairs, set with the Dasari sigil in their house colours, they're in one of the outer rows. They weren't all the way to the edge, but weren't all that near the centre either. You need binoculars to see anything happening on centre stage, and if the whole place didn't have an artificial climate, the seats would probably be in the clouds. But it was theirs. Shivanti liked to belong, the way fish like to be wet, and simple as it was, the chairs said that House Dasari belonged. However small, they had a stake in the empire. Naturally, Phrysis was aiming for a bigger stake, and had a fair chance at getting it. 3 years back, she'd been one of the 3 provincial managers to meet with Earth's governess, Katria Tassu herself, and the woman had made it pretty clear there was a barony in the works for each of them. In the end, it came down to having enough. The Shivanti had come down on resistance in the Middle East like a hammer, and pounded the place flat. Say what you will for the lack of subtlety, it had made the area quiet. Hotter than ever, but quiet. But what had really worked to calm things down was the Helcom. Phrysis had her share of counterparts all across the world, thank God, and when the Helcom had arrived in the Middle East, they'd rolled up their proverbial sleeves and started pushing the deserts back, turning privation into plenty. No one wanted oil anymore, and it was a lot harder to find people who wanted to fight when folks had full bellies, clean water, and happy families. Something he knew from experience. With a few nudges in the right direction, he and Phrysis had shaped the American Midwest, well, the Middle American sector, into an agricultural powerhouse. He'd met and exchanged a few words with men and women from places he'd never heard of. The Syrian farmer had been nice, though the Uzbek fellow had seemed a tad overwhelmed by it all. Thinking back on it still tickled him pink. Phrysis got a promise of a real title, McClendon Foods got a seal of approval from the planetary governess, and the world continued to calm down, as everyone finally got enough to eat. It was enough to make a farmer proud. Peace on Earth wasn't quite the same as peace at home, though, and he winced as Hannah elbowed Eli in the ribs. Hard. Back home, she probably would have smacked him upside of his head, but she had the good sense not to do that and shill. That boy better be careful. He ruins her good time, she'll be saving it for later. It was hard not to feel as proud as Thysis as he watched his kids. Not over a chair, but over what they'd become. Mostly. Hannah reminded him so much of Jen at her age. She was a lot more tech-savvy, and really loved the stuff, but the woman underneath was her mother's daughter. He squeezed Jen's hand a little harder. Somehow he'd gotten lucky. Life hadn't handed him many favours growing up, but somehow Jen had seen him past the rough parts and smoothed him away over the years. He'd never expected to end up on another planet, exporting food off Earth, but here they were, and Hannah was turning into a good woman. Which made him look at his sons. Problem with Cain and Abel was that Seth was a brother instead of a sister. Cain might have done alright with a smack in the head. That was the problem with being a parent. There wasn't a goalpost. There wasn't a point you got off the bus, quit work, or said the job was done. All the lessons you tried to pass on to your kids, well, you kept learning new ones as you got older, trying to pass those on too, and hope they listened. The older they got, the less they did, but you kept on learning things, and the more those lessons seemed harder won. More important. How to be poor had turned into how to be rich, and to know what had real value. Advice on first dates had become how to build families, how to stay out of the doghouse with your wife. Well, wives. Levi had always been easier, and as he watched, Zachariah felt a swell of pride. Levi had really made something of himself. Given the farm to work with and the chance from Phrysis, Levi had brought together a lot of the area's farmers, created a market for food exports that had given everyone a slice of the pie. With the help of Melody and Riala, their little farm had grown, and their family had grown. His quiet son had grown into a firm young man, but a fair one. He was still growing into who he'd be. 2 wives and 2 kids. A real business with a future. He's done a lot better than I was at his age. It didn't always seem real. He'd always tried to have his sons back, but Zach knew he'd let Levi down a time or two. Somehow, he'd always picked himself up. It had always been easier to rely on Levi. Sometimes that had meant he'd missed trouble brewing right under his nose. Watching Levi now, he couldn't help but note how his son's shoulders were a bit hunched in that way he got, and Melody was holding his hand a bit tighter than usual. Something looked like it was eating at him. He sighed and made a note of it. The young man could still get caught up in his own head, and... Hannah hit Eli in the ribs again. Harder. The Desaris were used to it, but he checked to make sure the tour guide didn't notice. Eli had always taken more time. The boy could work hard and apply himself, when it suited him. He had the gift of the gab, and it pained him to think how many times his younger son had talked himself out of, or into, things he really shouldn't have. How often he'd forgiven Eli wasn't the issue. You didn't stop loving your kids, but maybe somewhere along the way he should have smacked the boy upside the head once or twice. Mind, they were on vacation, but Eli hadn't come home from lunch the day before. Hannah said he'd crawled home around 5 in the morning. Looking at Eli's face, it didn't exactly take a diagram to explain. The grin on his son's face would have said more than enough, but the looks the girls were giving him had finished the job. Eli never had a problem sowing his wild oats. It was putting in the work around harvest where the boy lost interest. Melody and Ree fussing over Levi made quite a contrast to his younger son. Solana was over with Trixis, making herself scarce. Could have been her next to Eli. Chloe, too. That boy just can't settle down. Eli wasn't a farmer. He'd done the work, but he didn't have the patience. He and Jen had watched Eli go from that to construction, and while that had seemed good for a time, that had ended. Well, it could have ended a whole lot worse for Eli, but it was still a disaster. The heck of it was, the boy hadn't learned half the lessons he should have. After that ordeal, Phrysis and Nixie had stepped in. It had been pretty embarrassing, but you practiced what you preached. Nixie had offered help. Phrysis had backed her up, and he and Jen had done a bit to nudge Eli to it. When it was all over, Nixie's import business had a salesman. Course, there'd been some missteps before she settled on farming equipment, and a few bumps in the road after that, but Eli found a place, and the boy could sell himself. Perhaps a bit too well. Jen had been the one to point out how things had gotten a bit more strained between Eli and Levi. After the whole construction mess, Levi had tried to help. They'd grown together again. But after a while, well, Levi's life had taken off. The business, the wedding, the grandkids. Eli did alright, but his personal life, the things that mattered, hadn't gone exactly to plan. Eli didn't deal with jealousy all that well, and after Chloe left. Zechariah looked at his younger son a bit more keenly, as Eli laughed at something. His boys were men now, but he was still their father. Might be nothing, but it could bear sitting the two of them down together when they got home. And who knew? Could be this holiday was just the thing to settle them both down a bit. Smooth things over between them. It was a problem for another day. Today was time to take in the sights, and tonight Francis was taking the gals out for a night on the town. Burdin was promising the same for all the men. Keeping the men separated seemed odd, but just now it sounded like a good idea too. Giving the women space to do their own thing wouldn't be so bad. Jen would have a nice time, and Burdin knew how to cook. A good dinner out after a day seeing the sights sounded just fine. A quick meal out would help settle everyone down. It was a lazy afternoon, and Shil was doing his best imitation of a bad day in October. Cold, gloomy, and rainy, but that was par for the course of winter holidays, and took on part of the local charm. The Shilvanti hated cold, but braving the elements seemed to be as much of a tradition as bundling up the family to go out on Christmas, or standing around freezing to death watching fireworks on Guy Fawkes night. I wonder what that's called now. Tom Warwick was making coffee in their hotel room's kitchenette when he heard the knock on the door. Over on the couch, Miv nestled in on one side of Solani while Leia napped on the other. "I'll get it," he called out, letting the girls rest. The Desaris were out on the town, so he had time to relax before dinner. It was a girls' night out and a guys' night out. Burdin had been specific about dressing up, but that was Burdin's default mode. The problem was options. He had his Air Force tux, the Academy suit, the Pelavan suit, and that disco outfit he'd worn to the banquet. The girls had made sure he owned a suit for their honeymoon, though that seemed a little drab compared to Burdin on his worst day. He tabled the thought as he opened the door. "Hi, Professor Warwick." The words rang out in perfect stereo, and Tom peered in surprise at the smiling faces of the Kerbal twins. "Hi, girls. Come on in. What are you doing here?" He remembered to cock his head to one side. "I thought you were home for a Frovey." "We were," one of the girls chirped, as the other stepped inside. "Our parents accepted a design contract at a shipyard out near Redtress, though." "A big one," her sister nodded gamely, as he closed the door. "It's 6 weeks there and back, but they couldn't pass on a meeting." "Right, and it's not like we're kids anymore." The first one rolled her eyes ever so slightly. "Caslin?" "Exactly, but we didn't have our dorm rooms arranged over the holiday. No board contract," the other said pragmatically. "And that's Kamara." "So our parents rented a room here in the hotel for the holiday, sir." The girls nodded in unison. "We're just across the hall." "Well, that's nice. It's good to see you, and the girls will be glad you're here." "Are they here?" Ling cantered ahead toward Mara, who mimicked the action a second or so later. "We thought we'd catch up before dinner." Heads canted or no, Tom caught Lin's glance as her eyes flickered over toward the kitchen. Their stomachs didn't growl. With Shilvanti women, they didn't need to. Hunger was sort of a default setting. Melondi and Senshiki are over at the gym helping Desi with her physical therapy, but they should be back any time now. Why don't you come in and sit down? Are you hungry? "Oh, we couldn't impose. We ate hours ago, before we left home. Our father fixed breakfast. We got some instant papayas too, and some bagoon fritters at a convenience store." "Well, that's a shame. I have a bunch of leftover chicken from lunch," Tom shrugged, casting his bread upon the waters. "We were going to have it tonight, but some of us are going out to dinner instead. It's way too much for just the 3 of them." "Oh, well, if it's no trouble, we wouldn't say no. It would be a shame for it to go to waste." The pair nodded at each other to stick the landing. Tom chuckled, pointing them to the living room. "Go on in, I'll heat some up." Tom shook his head and wandered back to the kitchen, pulling out a plate of chicken to heat. But Dean let him bring home more than enough leftovers, on the condition that Tom joined him, while getting Miv, Leia and Solani out of the house with the Dasari women. It seemed like a good idea. Solani was up and about now. Her new arm would be regrown by the end of the holiday, but the prosthetic was just fine, and letting her feel normal again for an evening might be just what she needed. Miv and Leia had been game. Besides, it would give Badine some relief, and dinner out didn't sound so bad. Gives me a night off from cooking. Now, I just have to figure out a suit. Deshin looked spent after therapy, and after helping Zenshiki get her to the hotel, Melondi made her way back home. The dorm wasn't far, and it wasn't as if she was unsafe. Despite the winter chill, a groundskeeper was emptying the garbage can on the commons. With no one on campus, there was no garbage. It looked like Sergeant Marais, and Melondi picked up her speed. It was bad enough to be out in weather like this, but every time she was out in it, that meant at least one pod was watching her with boots on the ground. It didn't matter how many cameras were on her, Agent Davari had promised there would be a grounding within reach in a minute. It ought to have felt intrusive, but it didn't, which only made her more aware of how odd her life was. What's the point if I don't take this seriously? Desi nearly lost her life to protect me. The Des hairs watching over me would do the same in an instant, and I barely know their names. The least I can do is get out of the cold a little faster so they can too. There isn't much I can do. This is my life, but helping Deshin recover helps me, and I'm not just the spare air anymore. With no one around, the campus seemed ghostly. She felt herself flagging against the cold, but made it to her room and started to strip off her clothes. A steaming hot shower was what she needed. Helping Deshin work out was a workout in itself, and dinner sounded outstanding, right after she cleaned up. A whole night with her friends. Zenshiki counted in an unreal, acerbic sort of way. It would be just like a movie night in miniature. She missed the others already. It wouldn't be the same, but it would be close. Of course, part of that is missing Vadim, but seeing Vadim means seeing his family, which means going to the palace tomorrow. There were cameras on her, but there was no point in not saying it aloud. Before you start talking about it, yes, I know. I'll call her now. Melondi settled herself down on her bed rather than throwing herself down. Most days she could get away with a flop. Right now she could feel the eyes on her, and it needed some dignity. Picking up her omnipad, she dialed the number. Agent Davari, how can I help, Your Highness? I swear she must have her omni-ad glued to her hand. It didn't even ring twice. Good afternoon, Agent. I have an unusual situation and I need your help, please. I'm at your service, Your Highness. Then that was it. No questions asked, any more than her guardian commandos questioned their oaths. It was loyalty, to her mother, if nothing else. But if she asked Lamana Davari to shoot someone, it felt like the woman would only ask how many times. She'd grown up in her position, seen the Imperium working from her earliest memories. It felt invincible, and sometimes it felt frightening. The power of the Imperium was beyond most people's understanding. It might have been beyond mine before I met Professor Warwick. The power to change lives or destroy them. To rule over the galaxy and make lives better. That was the Imperium's destiny. To bring everyone up to a shared standard of prosperity. To never let the horrors of Urja happen again. To hold the horrors in the dark at bay and bring the light of civilization forth, at least as much as possible. But sometimes when people acted without question, that could be horrible too. Your Highness? Davari spoke again, and she realized she was wool-gathering. My apologies, Agent. I should have collected my thoughts before calling. It needed some consideration. Of course, Your Highness. Davari's tone was clipped and precise, so unlike the gushing professor who taught choir, that sometimes it was hard to believe they were the same woman. I need to go to the main palace tomorrow. And that requires Some consideration, Your Highness. As a Shorvanti princess, Kalira Tassu understood her place in the scheme of things. She was the Empress's daughter, which at least figuratively made her one of the three most powerful women in the entire Imperium. Given the hodgepodge nature of the alliance, no one there really counted, but there must be some daughter of the consortium who could say the same. That still made her one of the 12 most powerful women in the known galaxy. It just didn't feel that way. I need to go in a tour group with my boyfriend and his family. I see. So you'll want discretion. Yes, please. I know it's with no notice and I don't want to be any trouble, but they want to go tomorrow. We're here to serve, and that should provide ample notice to the staff who might recognize you. Most of the court has returned, but you remain unknown to many. I'll draft a memorandum this evening and transmit it to the palace. For a few hours tomorrow, everyone will do their very best to ensure your privacy. Thank you, Agent Davari. She breathed a sigh of relief. Lamana Davari was a scary woman at times, but part of that was her frightening efficiency. Tomorrow, it would work for her. I appreciate this very much. Of course, Your Highness. Kalira Tassu, Princess of the Shorvanti Imperium, hung up her omnipad, and the woman known as Melondi Sandoka grabbed her towel. A hot shower would feel so good before heading back over for dinner. Mel? Riala's face was split by a gleeful grin as she stuck her head around the corner of the living room. The suit's here. Melody bolted upright on the couch, her chosen vacation book forgotten. How's it look? Levi's voice echoed from the hall. I'm taking it off. You most certainly are not, Riala yelled back, beckoning Melody to follow. Come on. A man from Nuremberg would like to get in touch with the tailor. The two women dashed through the hallway, bursting into the bedroom at the back of the house. Where is he? Melody scanned the room. A terrible explosion destroyed a local glitter factory. Levi's voice came from the open door to the master bath. There were no survivors. Melody hurried over to the door. Oh, wow. It's like Elvis and Elton John's wardrobes had an abortion together. Riala frowned. Elton who? Melody hid a smile behind her hands and tried not to giggle. It's certainly eye-catching. Give us a 10, Riala spoke up from behind Melody. Levi slowly spun. Jared Leto would call this Gordian tasteless. It definitely emphasizes certain aspects of your physique, Riala said, as she shot a wink at Melody. Melody set her hands on Levi's shoulders and caught his eyes. It's a bit much, but it does fit you very well. She slid her hands down the front of the suit over the slick layers of sequins. Besides, I'm looking forward to helping you take it off when we're all back home. Oh yes, Riala agreed. Very much so. Fine. Berdin Dasari looked over the results of his handiwork and smiled. It was the smile of a job well done, and all the goddesses above knew he deserved it. Well, of course, the Thario family had a fair bit to do with the matter, too, but one thing at a time. Not that Brelek required any real effort, but Zachariah seemed like a chore. Brelek was adamant. Despite years of effort, the human refused to wear makeup, but at least he was dressed for the evening. Zachariah preferred blue, so Berdin had made the request specifically. Now, instead of the primitive denim, long flared cuffs wrought with blue lace worked up his forearms. The arrangement transformed spectacularly into a shitantilating wash of sapphire sequins running up his arms to spill playfully at the lacquered collar around the neck. It was superb. Brelak thought so too, though the human seemed bent on not saying a word. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Brelak, the two men exchanged a confident nod. Think of it this way. You're going to blend in, Brelak said soothingly. It must have worked, as Zach nodded mutely, though Berdin could swear he heard Jennifer McClendon break into another fit of laughter. At least the women were ready. It was a short drive over to collect the young men, then another to pick up Tom and his wives, before Francis took the women off for a night on the town. It would be some utterly pedestrian dinner looking over the capital, but Phrysis loved to make an impression. Not that Arinka Plaza was bad. The view displayed the capital better than most places in the city. The restaurants there were perfectly adequate, and it was a centre for nightlife. After all, that was why he suggested it. Getting the women out alone would be the perfect gift for Brelak, a chance to really enjoy the holiday. It wasn't as if Phrysis would be there. He'd worked hard to climb his way up in society, but she'd been too much of a prude to understand. The tire pool was just warming up for a trophy, so it would be such an evening to remember. Phrysis Asari smiled with satisfaction as she looked over her party. The men were just getting ready. Badin was being as fussy as ever, but some things never changed. Besides, Brelak had been loving every minute of it. She did have Badin to thank for introducing her to her husband. It was one of the odd things about her cousin. The man would take credit for anything, except for her Brelak. Meeting a man was the highlight of any young woman's life. There were always such hopes. The chance to meet a friend's brother, or your mother's working some connection. Without any brothers, she'd been desperate to find help, but Badin had never demurred. And one day, Brelak had appeared in her life. Sweet, innocent Brelak. She'd barely begun her career with the civil service, but it had been like they were meant for one another. Goddess, she was a lucky woman. She wouldn't have blamed Badin if he brought it up, but he never had. Who knew the way the male mind worked? It didn't matter. Right now, all that had to be done was herding their party out to pick up the children. Solana would stay behind to babysit Lagos, Cassandra and Joshua, giving the adults one night out to themselves. Of course, a men's night out wasn't a bad thing. Badin was a good host and Brelak would have a lovely time. It would even be good for Zachariah to get a more cosmopolitan perspective on the galaxy, and they could all find some secure little niche restaurant that knew how to cater to men. Giving her cousin his due, the food would be fabulous. Tonight, she and her co's could live it up. They were back in civilization at last. It wasn't home anymore. She'd grown fond of her piece of Earth, but there was no city in the galaxy like this one. I want to be a part of it, to show that we've really made it. Thankfully, Nixie and Akitai hadn't needed much convincing. Miara had practically leapt at the idea, and it wouldn't do the girls any harm to get a taste of the high life. She never dared step in the place before. Not that she could have afforded it after school, but at least Badin didn't work there anymore. She would have died of shame. Just for tonight, she and her co's would splurge. Somehow they convinced Jennifer and Melody. It was just a harmless night out on the town, and even without the extra entertainment, the food, the drinks, the sheer glamour of it all was said to be like nothing else in the galaxy. Tonight would be a night she and her girls could remember the rest of their lives. After all, everyone who was anyone knew there was no place like the tide pool.